Welcome to the PSIPHR podcast, where we discuss all things psi-related, such as remote viewing, intuition, and precognition. We'll also often be discussing the use of those skills, which helps better understand interesting esoteric and mysteries topics, with the occasional guest. I'm Brett Stewart, here alongside my talented co-hosts, David Harker and Emily Hayes.
Hi.
Hello.
We're all pretty excited to see where this podcast takes us, since we discuss these subjects all the time already, and after a bit of encouragement, we decided to buckle up and start recording these conversations. But I do think what makes this podcast unique is that both David and Emily are talented remote viewers who have also been applying their intuition and skill sets in the real world and also in some of these more fascinating esoteric areas. For me personally, I've been remote viewing since about 2010, and I've spent years looking into topics like ancient human history, non-physical or the spiritual realm, as well as things like the extraterrestrial phenomenon. Some of our podcasts are going to dive deep into these kinds of topics, while others are going to explore outlying concepts surrounding psychical functioning, and even things how you, the listener, can apply these skills practically. But before we jump down that rabbit hole, we thought it would be a good idea to start off discussing exactly that, the dangers associated with going off the deep end when we look at these topics. How do we navigate these areas without losing touch with reality? And what are some helpful tips on staying grounded? So we think this will be a useful show to the listener, and also, though, provide the stage for many of our upcoming shows. Before we jump in, though, maybe David and Emily, you could share a bit about yourselves for the listeners.
Hi, I'm Emily. I've spent most of my adult life studying esoteric topics, and I really like asking the big questions about the nature of reality. I'm really looking forward to exploring these topics in this podcast format with Brett and David.
Hi, I'm David. I've been a remote viewer for 3.5 years. I've practiced all sorts of meditation and magic and strange things. I'm interested in how the occult and esoteric overlaps with remote viewing and parapsychology, because I think we can get closer to the truth by approaching it from different angles.
So to begin this show, why don't we start with, what do we mean by going off the deep end? We should probably define that, since probably, depending on who you're talking to, it might mean something a little bit different. David, maybe you want to start with that.
Well, we had a little pre-game chat about this to try and define it, because everybody's got their own idea of what's true. We build these stories in our heads about how reality works, and who are we to sit here and say, well, we know how things work, we have the truth? You should listen to, there's a lot of people doing that and they don't agree. So what does it mean to go off the deep end? We could say, if you've got things in your worldview that are wrong, that mess the rest of it up, you can end up falling down deep rabbit holes of wild conspiracy theories and not be able to see where the error in reasoning is, because those beliefs remain unexamined. And it can be difficult to challenge those beliefs and to identify them in the first place. I've certainly had that experience. Maybe we'll touch on that later on. I think, Emily, you spoke about that too. We have to always be challenging our worldviews, but keeping grounded and not just believing whatever we hear on the internet. Well, especially not that.
I think it's important to be mindful of where most of us have come from growing up in possibly what I'm going to call default society or default worldviews that we are programmed with, we are narrated to, and we sort of fall in the absence of doing our own explorations in these topics, we sort of fall into a default way of seeing the world that aligns closely with our peers and the so-called authority figures that we see out there in society. And the interesting thing about those models, I think, is they're not necessarily accurate, in that there's information that's definitely being suppressed from them. However, they are functional in terms of allowing people to sort of go about their daily lives, have a job, have a normal family life, and so on. And so most people, I think, don't have a lot of practice in exploring these topics, so that they might wake up one day and realize everything isn't exactly as they've been told, but therefore they're ill-equipped to deal with this new world they've discovered, that things are different. And I think each of us have stories. Perhaps we'll share them later in the show here on what really prompted us to sort of snap out of our default narrative, default reality state into these other worlds, and how we oriented ourselves in those spaces.
I'm sure the listeners would be interested is how did we each, what was our moment? What happened to us each maybe that maybe broke us out of that default worldview? And I mean, I can just really briefly tell you what mine is. I saw a UFO. Is in 2010, I had a big triangle go right over my head in the San Francisco Bay Area. You know, if you've ever watched Star Trek, it took off at warp speed without making a sound. And that experience just shattered everything that I held as far as a model of what reality was or what was real. And that was certainly a table flipping moment. But then what do we do from there is where, well, do we go off the deep end or do we handle it responsibly? And I certainly didn't always handle it as responsibly as I would have liked. But I'm sure a lot of people have those kind of moments.
Yeah, I interestingly enough, I haven't had a single moment like you've described, Brett. However, there have been a number of tipping points or sort of turning points within my life that sort of awakened me to this larger reality. I do recall one evening when I was driving home from a work situation, and I had turned on the radio, and I heard this fellow named George Norrie on Coast to Coast AM, and he was interviewing this person about fairies. And at first I thought it was sort of one of these joke radio stations where they're just, I don't know, making things up for fun. But then the intensity and earnestness with which George Norrie was interviewing this guest was quite astounding. It was something I hadn't heard before in daytime talk show radio. And he really wanted to sort of get in there and understand this person's perspective, even though the person was talking about things that to most people out there in the world would seem absolutely crazy. They're talking to fairies in their backyard. But it really made me, I've always wanted to look for opinions that were contrary and sort of support the underdog or look beyond the surface. And it really opened my eyes to the fact that you can research these topics with a sense of earnestness and yet not just allow it to change your whole worldview if it doesn't make sense.
Well, I had a moment, but it unfortunately didn't involve a UFO. I still don't really know what happened. I think maybe some kind of technical Buddhist would be able to put a label to it. But I used to be a full-blown materialist, reductionist. Oh, that's all made up. Those people must be crazy. I didn't believe any of this stuff, but I didn't have a good argument for it. It was just like, well, I know that's impossible, so that's all I need to think about it. I don't need to work out why it's impossible or why all these people have all these experiences. That's just in crazy land. I never thought about it. And then one night I was ruminating on three very difficult questions I had, which were all practical day-to-day stuff about sort of investment and what have you. They were mundane questions, but I realized that the models I had of how the world works weren't capable of addressing these. Like I actually saw my models fail, and I completely gave up. I just, like, my intellect or ego, whatever it was, just surrendered and stopped. It was just like, I throw my hands up. And it was Christmas Eve. I remember about 11:30 at night. I was just drifting off to sleep when I had this, and so I just lay there, like, I give up. I don't know what to do. And in that moment of, I suppose you could call it surrender, something kind of went ding in my perception, like something snapped or changed, or like there weren't choruses of angels or trumpets from heaven or anything. Nothing actually changed, but at the same time, everything did. I had no idea what happened, and it was like Christmas Eve. I had a Christmas lunch to cook the next day, so I was like, well, I'm going to have to put this on the back burner, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. It was something I would have to address. I just knew. But coming from, having no background in this stuff at all, I then just went on a deep dive of like, I know I've missed something. I know I'm wrong about something, but I have no idea what it is. So now I've got to reconsider all of this stuff that I wrote off as crazy. So I went on like a months-long dumpster diving expedition through the internet and all its weird corners of conspiracy this and crazy that. Um, Trying to find something I could test empirically myself without joining a cult or paying $600 for a seminar. I just wanted, there should be an experiment I can do at home that will show me factually so I don't have to take anybody's word for it. And eventually I stumbled across remote viewing, and I was sat there going, well, that's stupid, that can't work, that's impossible. But I tried it because I promised myself I would be empirical and not make any assumptions. So I tried it expecting it to fail, and then it worked. And that was a bit of a oh shit moment for me. So yeah, from then on I've been continuing to pick away at it.
And it may be useful here to just give a really brief, simple explanation without going into the nitty gritty details. What is remote viewing? There may be some people who are listening to this podcast who aren't exactly familiar with that term. And really, all remote viewing is it's a methodology that allows the individual to describe non-local sites, and where you describe information about a subject that you have no idea what you're describing. So it might be, this is referred to as being blind to a tasking. So a really brief example is a simple one that you might give to a beginner. You have a photo of the Eiffel Tower. Now they don't know it's of an Eiffel Tower, but you give that task to them to say, okay, describe whatever intuitively comes into your mind. I've picked something out for you, just describe it. And for whatever reason, the human mind, the human consciousness has the ability to seemingly tune into that, whatever that is, and describe it. And so this is where this word, the name of remote viewing, it's like an individual is able to describe something remotely without being there and looking at it. And you can take this to really advanced places where you can use it to problem solve what's broken on your motor vehicle. You can use it to describe and get information on where the stock market is going. You can use it to look at mysteries targets. These are things that I know a lot of remote viewers are really interested in. Well, what does remote viewing have to say about the pyramids and how they were created? And you can do that. You can get information, and it's very much a skill of describing something without naming it, and you can get very useful information with this skill.
I think we should also note about terminology with remote viewing. A lot of people assume from that name that it's a visual phenomena, which, that's a part of it, but it isn't really about the seeing. It is about the describing, and the seeing is sometimes a part of that. The terminology comes out of the US military project, which developed remote viewing as a intelligence gathering tool over 20 years. It's a long and complicated saga, all of that, but the term remote viewing is unfortunate, and it's often an overloaded term as well. Once remote viewing was declassified, anybody doing anything remotely psychic was like, "Oh, I'm something of a remote viewer myself, don't you know?" And there is the important distinction with remote viewing that the viewer is blind to the target, so there's no imagination, no cheating, no guesswork, because you could be describing literally anything, which is why that was a pivotal moment for me, because there's no way that I could have known. There had to be something else going on. I still don't know what it is.
I had a similar experience where I wasn't certain if this was real, but then when I actually did it and I was drawing sketches of something that I couldn't know in advance, and the sketch matched what the photo feedback was later on, it was another one. Like, I saw a UFO. That was a table flipping moment. And then I had another table flipping moment when I was just exploring a lot of these areas, one of them being remote viewing after that experience. And wait, human consciousness can describe things at a distance anywhere in time, seemingly?
Yeah, that brings to mind this whole idea that one of the ways you can discern what is real is like there's a common theme between yourself and David. You both described a mechanism of action whereby you personally experienced something that was difficult to deny or impossible to deny. Even though you may have had some cognitive dissonance around these things in the past, you sort of were confronted with, no, this is a direct experience and I cannot ignore this information. And when we're building models of our reality, I think that's a very important factor, is that you have these direct experiences that you have, that you know are real, right? And that you have to factor those into whatever model of the universe you come up with down the road. It's sort of like data that has to become part of your model somehow. And how you know that your model, I think, is improving, because there's no perfect model. There are only models that are approximating reality, but how you know it's improving is that it predicts things. You can use your model to say, well, if this and this and this are true, therefore this other thing over here must be true. And you go and look and it turns out that it is, well, your model is probably accurate. It has no inconsistencies.
Well, maybe it is accurate, or maybe it is useful. But as one of my favorite quotes of all time is from an economist, I think he's an economist, George Box, which is that all models are wrong and some are useful, because a model is never going to have the complexity of the thing that it's modeling. So it's always got limitations, and I think some of this is about seeing where are the limitations of the model, how far out can we go with these predictions before the model breaks.
And I think this ties right into our topic for this show, which is going off the deep end, because I think when you're operating with a model that not only is wrong, but you're not asking the questions of whether it's wrong, you're not pressing it for, okay, where are there cracks? Because even, I've been doing remote viewing for 12 years now. I do it in a professional capacity. I do a lot of work in the financial sector, in the stock market. And so there's a lot of feedback I'm getting on, are my forecasts right or wrong? They above statistical probability? What's the Z-score? All these things are constantly being measured, and it's my profession. But I'm constantly asking the question, what am I getting wrong? What don't I know that I don't know? And I think unless you go into this area with being your own skeptic of your own experience and not just saying, okay, well, this is just the way reality is, I've settled on it. I think the moment you settle on this is the way things are is the moment that you become trapped and you can't really grow or learn anything really beyond what you've already accumulated or acquired. So it's a constant process of almost humbling yourself to what's out there and being open, but then also not being don't be someone's sucker too. Like I wouldn't want we're going to have shows talking about really interesting topics and out there things that we find fascinating or other people find fascinating. Is I wouldn't want anyone to take my work and just believe it full scale. Like that is not what I do for other people's work, and I would hope that's not what people do for even my own work or things that I say. It's like you should constantly be self-evaluating yourself. I know we'll be talking more about that later, but I think it's important.
Your point about humbling, I think we could desk flip that, seeing as we've been doing a lot of desk flipping today. Because when we have beliefs, we can identify with our beliefs, and we'll cover the topic of cults a bit later. But if you are a supporter of a particular sports team or a political party or a religious group or whatever, the social pressure of that affiliation with the group and framing yourself as a member of the group gives you preset beliefs. And I am a is a thing that you'll say. And because I am a, I believe so and so. And when things come along which threaten those truths, those beliefs that you have, if something comes along that shows them to be false, that's perceived as an attack on the self. It's an attack on ego, identity. It's actually an existential threat, which is why sometimes if you can mention these topics to people, they'll either go, oh, that's interesting, maybe I'll give it a try, or they'll go, it's impossible, it's dumb, or they'll get angry. They'll get really angry and defensive. And, people often ask, why do people freak out when you talk about this stuff? Why do they get so triggered and flip out? And it's because you are essentially holding a gun to their head intellectually because you're threatening their worldview. And our sense of identity, our sense of self, is constructed on top of worldview, right? If when you were born, if that exact same baby came out of somebody in a different country at the same time, you would be a completely different person, right? Because your sense of self is a reaction to the world that you find yourself in. It's a construct.
That's a scary thing for most people. And by pushing a lot of this stuff that is in the esoteric, whether it's mystery, anomalies that exist in the world, whether it's remote viewing, anomalous cognition, these things upset those. And they, saying most is probably not right, because I feel like society is changing. There's a lot more acceptance to look into these subjects. I mean, you can just look at the amount of podcasts out there on these subjects, and they're growing. And this is why it's like the perfect time to do this kind of a show, because there are people that are looking for a different point of view than the default. We don't have the answer. We have a point of view. We're explorers just like everybody else. And I think that's important to recognize that we're not a guru here, and none of us would ever claim to be that. But I think that there's more people are looking, because it's hard not to anymore. There's too much going on in the world to keep your head buried in the sand about a lot of these topics. A lot of people still do, but a lot of people aren't anymore, which is why it's a perfect time, I think, to have these discussions.
Yeah, there's I just wanted to add to David's point that it's very important to be mindful of the groups that we mentally join, in terms of there are all these identities that we attach to ourselves by just mentally joining groups. Oh, I am this nationality, this particular profession, this particular whatever property that exists in my life. And then when we're confronted with information that might attack this particular group, it ends up creating this existential threat to one's own being. And I've encountered this in my life. I like asking very probing and challenging questions to people, and I'm okay with a lot of contrary perspectives and conflict in these conversations, but I've noticed they almost always blow up in my face because I have just poked someone's worldview, and they'll attack me personally as opposed to attacking the ideas. It took me many years to work this out, but they'll attack me personally because I'm in front of them, confronting them with this uncomfortable question that they don't have the ability to ask themselves, because it would mean dismantling their whole everything, their whole way of seeing the world. It's very uncomfortable. So
yeah, the opposite can also, I've had experience with kind of the polar opposite of that at this as well, where several years ago I made a bunch of YouTube videos discussing my more esoteric remote viewing work over the years. And I decided to take those down and not really put them back up, for reasons that I've talked a little bit about publicly before. And so even coming back and doing this podcast is a little bit of deciding a new path for myself in my own remote viewing work and what I'm going to share and what I'm going to talk about. But I took those down because what was occurring, even though I tried to say, hey, this is just information, don't take this too literally. A lot of this information is non-feedbackable, which means take it more as just another interesting piece of information and not as this is what for sure reality is. But a lot of people, just the medium and maybe the time and the way I was presenting it, that's not what a lot of people were doing it. They were taking it and it was getting incorporated in other, from my discernment, cult-like operations, and individuals were taking my work and using it to promote their culty looking stuff, which I really was not a fan of being a part of or helping. And then I was getting lots of emails from people who were taking this information and, well, going off the deep end, and where it was very unhinged and a little scary, as I was getting reached out by people who were watching that content. And I realized that I didn't know how to do it really talk about this in a responsible way yet. at that point. So I just backed completely off from it. And so I think this is a good segue into our next topic, which is kind of how to spot this.
Yeah, about it being the opposite of identifying with specific beliefs and defending them. If your belief structure, if your worldview is particularly divergent or particularly loose, then anything almost can confirm those beliefs, and you can kind of pull that video that I'm not going to name because I know people will go and find it on YouTube because people keep uploading it. But people will pull anything and everything in and just build this kind of melting pot. And when you can't look at, you can't hold the whole of your worldview in your working memory at one time, right? You can only, it's like having a little flashlight poking about. You can only look at individual bits, so you can't see how incoherent it's become, and you just end up living in this fantasy world. I think it's, yeah, it happens a lot. It's not, well, I mean, who am I to say? But I don't think it looks healthy.
Well, it also, the environment that we live in with social media and the algorithms is that it actually, YouTube, for example, and other platforms, they constantly bombard you if they realize this is your interest, where, oh, you're really interested in just the nonstop conspiratorial information. It just gives you more and more and more and more and more of it, as opposed to saying, hey, maybe also take a look at this more grounded approach or a different perspective that isn't quite as extreme. We live in a society that supposes or to promote this idea of fact checking, when usually that's not really what's going on in those things. But it's almost like we need to promote in our society, perhaps, or even in this field, a little bit more, at least I think, my opinion is, a little bit more self questioning. And is this really something that is not only just true, but what does it mean? And if this could also be wrong, what does that mean?
One of the challenges I think that many people face is that, and this myself included, and I'm sure that Brett and David have had similar experiences. In school, we weren't taught how to do critical thinking in any meaningful way. Maybe we had lip service paid to critical thinking, generally speaking, how one might go about this, but actually applied critical thinking skills are very rare if you went to the default school system in the Western world. And these skills are very useful in not only detecting, have I gone down the rabbit hole on a conspiracy? They are just as useful at detecting, is this counterintelligence or propaganda that I'm being fed to believe the opposite or to continue down the rabbit hole. So there are traps everywhere, and the only defense we have against these traps is good discernment, and good critical thinking is a part of that.
What is good discernment, though? What does that mean to you?
It's there's an element of balance between, I think, a consistent and cohesive model. So in other words, is this information that's coming in to my awareness a part of this model? Can I integrate it into my model of how the world is? That, coupled with how I integrate this information, I apply critical thinking skills to discern, is this something that is actually true, or is this something that is maybe true? And that's another element of this. Maybe is also a category or a question mark. And many people are very uncomfortable with question marks. This ties back to what we were talking about earlier with certainty and this craving for certainty. Sometimes in these explorations, you have to be okay with, I don't know, or this might be true, until proven otherwise, or until more information comes in. That's another aspect that is very important to cultivate in going down these esoteric journeys.
I have nearly everything filed under question mark. Nothing is black and white for me anymore. Everything's shades of grey and question mark. I just wanted to add, you talked about the intellectual side of discernment. I think it's there's also kind of emotional, personal levels of it as well, because I think especially people who practice meditation will be better at recognizing this. But if somebody comes along and gives you a new fact for you to test against your worldview, you're going to have a somatic, emotional reaction that will, involves the subconscious mind and the body and however you want to slice the human being up. But there is almost a reflex action that arises when you hear that is not a slow intellectual process that we then go through consciously afterwards. And I think training to become aware of that in yourself and to watch that process happen, that can give you a lot of clues about the nature of the stimulus, if you like. Because somebody can come along and say something that's very compelling story. It could be flattering. It could be very hopeful. It could be causing a strong positive or negative reaction in a broad audience. And if you notice yourself having a big emotional reaction to something, I think it's important to say, why is that happening? And introspect on that a little bit, because it can tell you about yourself, and what blind spots you might have, and it can tell you about the potential intent of the person selling that information.
Well, we've talked a little bit about what is going off the deep end, where to find it, and we really haven't talked about what's the consequences of it. Is that if you do that, what happens? Why is this really, where's the significance, I guess, in this topic as far as why it's important not to do this? And I think one of the areas, and I can just give a really brief story on this from a remote viewing perspective. Yeah, and if there's people who are familiar with remote viewing and those who publish content out there, there's some pretty wild content out there that is certainly, to me at least, off the deep end. It's just very out of touch with reality. Doesn't mean you shouldn't look at things that are in the clouds, but if you're not double checking to make sure your feet are still on the ground as best as you can, then you may as well float off to Never Never Land, perhaps. But there's a very specific example I could point to as far as a practical disadvantage in the terms of remote viewing. And I know a lot of the people that probably would be listening to this podcast early on, at least, are going to be remote viewers. When I learned remote viewing, I learned from one of the military guys who was in the military program to use remote viewing for intelligence and that whole jazz. But I didn't really start until 2010. And so this came out in the mid 90s is when this first came out. So there's 15 years of people practicing this, applying it, learning it, doing the research before I even got involved or interested in this field. And I was having a discussion with my mentor, and he told me about one of his past students who was really, really good, who was able to almost never missed a tasking, had really high level detailed information about whatever problem was being tasked, whether it was an operational task, like where is this missing person, or what's the condition of a missing person, or something else that was maybe more operationally business focused. They were very, very good. And they even went on a couple of times on television to show off their skill set, which was impressive. But what occurred is this person was also highly, highly fascinated with things that are going on in the non-physical realm. So spirits and a lot of that esoteric area, and it kind of overwhelmed their focus and what they were interested in pursuing. And what actually ended up occurring is my teacher told me that they became completely unusable as a remote viewer for any topic or any project, because every single time they do a remote viewing session, all of their work was describing how there were spirits everywhere, and the topic was about what's broken on the Jeep that we need to get fixed. Something very down to earth, very practical. Hey, we need to let's quickly remote view this vehicle. There's a problem. Let's just cut to the chase and figure out what needs to get fixed. And instead, getting information about how the spirits of the earth are doing X, Y, and Z, and also there's this man-made vehicle. And so just what it did actually practically for the remote viewer is they went off the deep end a little bit in that territory, and it affected their viewing and their lens in remote viewing to where they just no longer were useful as far as someone who is attempting to solve real world problems. So it was noise. It added a tremendous amount of noise to their work. And so I don't know, maybe Emily or David, you have other things you've seen or that are similar to this, where like, what's the disadvantage, the practical disadvantage to going off the deep end? What is that? What happens?
The practical disadvantage in my mind of going off the deep end, aside from, I mean, there are very real health concerns as well. Mental health can be a big deal. There's a lot of individuals, and myself included, and I think all of us have some level of trauma that we've experienced in our life, and these traumas can be, and I think we may even do a whole episode on just trauma and dealing with trauma. But if these things aren't in check before you're going off the deep end, they can be exacerbated in ways that will actually cause things like psychotic breakdowns in people, and a severe mental health challenges that can have very, very dire consequences. So that's a bit of an extreme example, but these things can happen, and I think it's important to not only have this discernment when going into these esoteric topics, but also making sure you've done your housekeeping, so to speak, in terms of your mental well-being, ensuring that you've dealt with any unhealed traumas as best you can from where you are before you go off exploring these topics that can really just exacerbate any problems that you've got already in your psychology.
I think that's a super good point. Another example that just sprung to mind for me is the New Age and all of the love and light, peace and love people who say that they're star seeds or light workers, or notice these I ams, and these are often, all of this positivity can become toxic positivity, and you're then denying the more nuanced reality of what might be going on, and kind of almost living in a bit of a fantasy world, or creating a kind of separate subjective experience where you're gonna, whatever you experience, you're gonna interpret it through the lens of your worldview, right? Things will come into your ears and your eyeballs, little sensory stimuli, and you will go, well, I don't believe in that, so it can't be something esoteric. It must have been a shadow. It must have been my imagination. Or, so if you build a worldview which is quite restricted, then it will give you blind spots. And blind spots are weaknesses which, could be exploited by somebody malicious, or, they could just be natural. You bump into things in the dark.
Yeah, those blind spots, I think, tie back into what I was saying about trauma. They can actually create, so if you do have these blind spots in your worldview, and you are confronted with, say, a creature in the woods that defies everything you've ever been told about can even exist, or a UFO, you can actually induce a trauma. And there are entire podcasts dedicated to helping people deal with the traumas from these experiences where their worldview was abruptly shattered. So the one of the effects of having such a narrow and fragile worldview is that at some point, if you get confronted by the reality of things that are outside of it, and there, for many people, are many things that are outside of their worldview, it can have a very traumatic effect itself, and actually perpetuate new traumas.
That happened to me. um, in some of the literature, that in the extreme, that process is referred to as the dark night of the soul, which I thought was limited to artists and poets, but it turns out it's a psychological process of it's the dark night of the ego. Really, it's the collapse of the self, and it gave me two extremely tough, unpleasant, and confusing years. And I'm out the other end of it now. I'm very glad for that. But it took a long time to resolve the psychological destabilization from.
Yeah, with regards to remote viewing, and I certainly, and I've heard this experience from many other remote viewers who stick with it, is there's a moment where, for me, it was about a little bit over a year into remote viewing, and I had done hundreds of sessions by that point. I had this just wake up moment where it's like, okay, is this really real, or have I been deluding myself this entire time? And it was this standing on a weird precipice of, okay, if this is real, then holy shit. But if it's not, wow, I've wasted a lot of time. I feel really stupid. Am I really stupid? And so it was really concerning to me, actually, where I was scared to know the answer for a period of time. Where did I waste all of these hundreds of hours putting into learning this skill, to doing sessions, and I was forcing all of these squares into round holes, say, yeah, psychical functioning is real. Yeah, I can describe a photo without seeing it to a decent degree. Yeah, I can. The consciousness is a really fascinating, wild thing. Maybe I never saw that UFO. It was all in my imagination, and I'm just living in a big dream world of imagination. Is that really what's going on? And I had to confront that. And it was certainly unnerving. It took a period for me to get over. But what I did, I don't know if everyone necessarily does the same thing, but for me to get through that, it was about actually really going through everything with a fine tooth comb and saying, is there anything I've missed? Have I not been honest with myself in one area? Is there something I've been trying to avoid looking at, whether it was a fear or a concern, that's perhaps kept me from seeing the truth that was there all along? And I spent that time, and it is a little bit of it's not a dark night. It was a couple dark weeks of the soul for me, really going back through all my stuff and self-questioning, and then kind of settling on, no, there's too much here. There's too much for me to say was coincidence or chance. There's just too much there. And then when that hit me, it was another, just like a bell was rung almost, and it was reverberating me like, yes, that changes everything. Let's go see what's on the other side. And I haven't looked back since. It's been an explore journey since.
I didn't really have that with remote viewing so much. When I first started, I believed it was impossible. And then I did like 50 sessions and got some amazing hits that were it was just like statistically impossible that I was deceiving myself. But there was still the main part of me believed it was impossible. So for weeks I was doing something successfully, couldn't refuse it, but also believed it was impossible. And then at some point that part of me just kind of died down. And I have, like, over the years, occasionally you think, really? Is this really real? This can't be real. This has got to be impossible. And then I just go look at some of my past sessions and go, no, it's impossible for this not to be real looking at this. It's way more likely to be real than not.
One of the things that I think makes us even question, is this real, has to do with our cognitive bias on the pre-existing worldviews that we've grown up in. So all of us were growing up into these narratives that were pushed to us. And because of that, this phenomenon that is real, that we really do experience, seems weird and crazy. And it has a very, how shall I say, I think shocking effect on us when in fact, if we hadn't had that other programming, if there had been no pre-existing other normal, so-called normal programming in our minds, we would encounter this phenomenon and go, oh yeah, there it is. Of course this is fine. Of course this is normal. This is real. And we wouldn't have had these doubts. So that's my theory anyway. Obviously we don't know, but
I think people from cultures where this stuff is more normal don't have this problem that we, as kind of default belief system Western educated people, do. So I think that bears out your theory.
Well, I think this is a good place to end this first show. And I think we had a lot we discussed about going off the deep end, where it exists, perhaps why it exists, some of our experiences. We are going to have an after hours show for the PSIPHR podcast. It's kind of our structure we're doing, is we're doing about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour just available for anyone who wants to listen. And then we're going to kind of just take it as long as just open discussion between ourselves, talking a little bit about our own experiences, probably a little bit more. Somehow, I think we're going to talk about a little bit how we tackled some of the big pitfalls in our own lives in the after hours. If you are interested in listening to the after hours, that is going to be a subscription model for our podcast. So if you want to support us, learn a little bit more about us, hang out with us longer, we are going to have that available. You can sign up on our website, which is you can see they're going to be the remoteviewingpodcast.com or PSIPHR.com. Either one will work. But yeah, this is, I think, a good place to wrap up here. Any kind of final thoughts?
So I think in after hours, I would like to discuss some personal experiences I've had in dealing with some of the pitfalls. And I also think that it's important to touch briefly on some of the methodologies and directions people can take on their own initiative to develop critical thinking skills. There are definitely some good tools out there now that helped me develop them. And all of this was learned after school or official school ended and the real school of life began.
Well, I mean, education is what's left once you've forgotten everything you learned in school, right? In the after hours bit, I want to talk about the development of discernment as opposed to critical thinking and the more intuitive aspects of that, because we're going to deal with a lot of pretty esoteric content, and critical thinking can only get you so far because this stuff is so subjective. And also the role of teachers and traditions in that as well. So the good and the bad.
Yeah, I think the after hours is also a place where we'll be able to be a little bit more candid with some of our own personal experiences. So if that's something you are interested in and you want to hang out with us or be supportive of this podcast and the show, head on over to our website. You can sign up for that. And I think what our schedule for this podcast is going to be is we want to be releasing one free show a week, and then we'll have one after hours guaranteed going along with that if you're a subscriber. And then I'm sure we'll have lots of extra bonus content along the way. So we're excited to do more of these. We're certainly a little bit green around the ears, but I think this was a cool discussion to have. And there'll be lots of interesting topics and discussions in the future. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.